Alrighty, welcome back to podcast 5. And, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard someone say, all the research says, well, maybe in a debate or on the news or in a casual conversation, it sounds authoritative, right? It just shuts the door on disagreement. But here's the question. Does all the research really say that, or is this phrase really doing something else entirely? Today we're looking at Chris Earle's 2022 article, and it offers us a powerful lens for thinking about not just policing, but how public debates are framed, controlled, and in some cases manipulated. For some context, after George Floyd's murder in 2022, the U.S. erupted in protests and calls for reform, but almost immediately there was pushback. Defenders of the police rushed to the airwaves and op-ed pages, the think tank saying, wait a minute, the numbers don't actually prove racism. One police chief, Major Travis Yates in Tulsa, went on radio and claimed that Black Americans aren't more likely to be killed by police. In fact, he said, all the research showed the opposite. That statement was full of falsehoods, but notice the rhetorical move, invoking science, research, expertise. It makes the claim sound unshakable even when it's not. Earle argues that this isn't just sloppy reasoning, it's deliberate strategy, what he calls manufactured consensus. Manufactured consensus happens when people present a messy, contested issue as if it's already been resolved by science. Instead of acknowledging the uncertainty in the data, they highlight that uncertainty in a very specific way to dismiss challenges. Here's how it works. So when critics point to racial disparities in police shootings, defenders counter with, well, the experts don't agree, the data isn't complete, there's no consensus. This sounds like careful skepticism, but what it really does is shut down the conversation. It shifts the frame from lived experience and systemic critique into a narrow technical sphere, a place where only certain voices, usually from select experts, are allowed to count. Take Rudy Giuliani, for example, on Fox News. He responded to outrage over George Floyd's killing by comparing it to crime statistics. He said, essentially, more Black people are killed by other Black people than by the police. Therefore, police bias can't be the issue. That's a false comparison. But notice the pattern, selective statistics presented as if they close the case. Manufactured consensus turns the uncertainty of social science into a weapon, and it reinforces a dangerous message that critics are emotional, unscientific, and irrational, while defenders are rational, data-driven, and just following the facts. This connects to Earle's second big theme, the burden of proof. Normally in a fair debate, both sides carry some responsibility to support their claims, but in this controversy, defenders flip it around. They insist that unless critics can prove with absolute certainty that policing is racially biased, then policing must be assumed fair. Think about how heavy that bar is. Proving racism in policing is incredibly difficult, especially because, as Earle notes, the data is incomplete. There's no single national database tracking every police shooting. Much of what we do have come from journalists and activists filling the gap. So defenders take that gap, that uncertainty, and use it to their advantage. They argue from ignorance, saying essentially, if you can't prove it beyond doubt, then it doesn't exist. That's not neutral, that's stacking the deck. Earle points out several cases where studies were misrepresented. For instance, economist Roland Fryer published a controversial study suggesting there was no racial bias in police shootings. That study, widely cited by defenders, even after the author himself walked back aspects of it. Instead of engaging honestly with the complexity of the research, defenders cherry-picked the results, ignored contradictions, and presented it all as if there were a rock-solid scientific consensus. This is manufactured consensus in action, not just disagreeing with critics, but reshaping the very terrain of debate. Well, why does this matter? Well, because when the rules of debate are tilted, real accountability becomes almost impossible. If every attempt to highlight racial disparities is dismissed as unscientific, if every data set is called incomplete, if every critic is told their evidence doesn't meet the bar, then we never get to the core issue. Communities that experience police violence day after day are told their experiences don't count because all the research supposedly says otherwise. And that's the danger of manufactured consensus. It doesn't just distort facts, it changes who gets to speak, whose voices are credible, and who bears the impossible burden of proof. So next time when you hear someone say, all the research says, pause and ask yourself which research, whose research, and what research is being left out, and what assumptions are hiding underneath that claim of uncertainty, of certainty. Because often it's not really about the data at all. It's about who gets to define the truth. Yeah, that's podcast 5. Cue the outro.